Well, like Sean said, my name is James. At least that's what I tell the IRS. Now, I wanted to see, how many of you guys enjoyed the morning sessions we had so far? Yeah, they did a good job. They did a really good job. Good, I'm glad you enjoyed that, because it's pretty much downhill from here. Just want to be honest with you. We pretty much phoned in the rest of the presentations, so we really didn't expect that many of you to come back from lunch. But here you all are. So at least you enjoyed the first half. No, I'm joking. Actually, Marty, Robbie, and I have put together some great presentations for you over the lunch break. So you have that to look forward to. So at least there's that. All right, well, like Sean said, I'm here to talk about this issue of tolerance, which is really relevant in our day and age, because we live in a very polarized, very divided culture. There are such strong emotions and strong convictions on both sides of so many issues. Issues like abortion, homosexuality, transgender issues. You've got immigration issues. You have Republican versus Democrat. You've got Uber versus Lyft, iPhone versus Android, right? All the big issues. And you end up with shouting and anger on all sides and almost no open, thoughtful dialogue. Where two people who disagree actually talk about it and think it through. That almost never happens today. It seems like there's no way to discuss these divisive issues and certainly no hope of reaching any sort of agreement. But that's not how it's always been. Actually, I think it was relatively recently that people lost hope in open-minded, thoughtful dialogue. Instead, I think tolerance used to be more common. But we need tolerance now more than ever before. But unfortunately, we see intolerance all around us, all around our culture. In fact, let me give you some examples of the intolerance that I see in our culture. And just as I relay these stories, pay attention and try to decide for yourself who you think of all these stories as being the most intolerant. So just kind of take a vote between these different stories and see who's being the most intolerant here between these stories. So first, for my first example, how many of you heard about what the owner of Chick-fil-A said that got him in trouble? Anyone hear about that? Okay, quite a few of you. Well, for those of you who don't know, here's basically what happened. In 2011, reports came out that Chick-fil-A had donated money to a charitable organization called the Windshake Foundation. Now that's actually not very surprising, because the Windshake Foundation was actually started by the original founder of Chick-fil-A. So it makes sense that they would donate money to that organization. What made it problematic was that Windshake then gave some of that money to various organizations that opposed same-sex marriage. They were against same-sex marriage. Well, in 2012, it got worse because the owner of Chick-fil-A, the current owner of Chick-fil-A, Dan Cathy, was interviewed on the radio. And during that interview, he was asked about his opinion about the many children who grew up in a house without a father in the household. And he said that children need a mother and a father. Then he said this, quote, "I think we are inviting God's judgment on our nation when we shake our fist at him and we say we know better than you as to what constitutes a marriage. I pray God's mercy on our generation that has such a prideful, arrogant attitude to think that we have the audacity to define what marriage is about." Well, as you can imagine, people all across the nation were outraged. In fact, the Philadelphia councilman, Jim Kenney, wrote a letter to Dan Cathy. And in that letter, he said this, quote, "As an American, you are legally entitled to your opinion, regardless of how insensitive and intolerant it may be. But as a fellow American and as an elected member of the Philadelphia City Council, I'm entitled to express my opinion as well. So please, take a hike and take your intolerance with you." In fact, the mayor of Boston told Dan Cathy, he said, quote, "I urge you to back out of your plans to locate in Boston. There's no place for discrimination in Boston and no place for your company." And the alderman of Chicago said, he added this, he said, quote, "If you are discriminating against a segment of the community, I don't want you in our town. Chick-fil-A values are not Chicago values. So that's the Chick-fil-A example. Oh, sorry, I should have put the quote up there. There you go. You also have it in your packet there. For the next example, how many of you heard about what Phil Robertson from Duck Dynasty said that got him in trouble? How many of you heard about it? Okay, several of you. Well, for those of you who don't know, here's the story. Duck Dynasty started as a small reality TV show about a family that makes duck calls. You know, little thing, it looks like a kazoo, but it makes the sound of a duck. Yeah. And it aired on A&E. So this is not exactly like the best formula for TV success. But by 2013, it was the most popular show on all of cable television. And in fact, it ran for 11 seasons. So it was pretty successful. Well, late in 2013, GQ magazine interviewed the head of the Duck Dynasty family. That would be Phil Robertson. And let's see if I can get that. Yeah, Phil Robertson. And during that interview, when he mentioned the word sin, the interviewer asked him, well, what do you consider to be sinful? Well, Phil Robertson answered this way. He said, quote, start with homosexual behavior and just morph out from there. Bestiality, sleeping around with this woman and that woman and that woman and those men. Well, as you might expect, the LGBT community was deeply offended. And A&E quickly pulled Phil Robertson from the whole show. And in fact, Wilson Cruz, who's a representative of the organization GLAAD, it's a gay rights organization, he praised A&E for taking a stand against discrimination. He said, quote, he went on TV and said this, quote, by taking quick action and removing Robertson from future filming, A&E has sent a strong message that discrimination is neither a Christian nor an American value. So that's the Duck Dynasty example. Now for this next example, how many of you heard about the backlash against the Southern Baptist Convention for trying to convert Jews in Chicago? How many of you heard about that? A few of you, mostly no. That isn't surprising, because this actually happened back in the year 2000. And some of you probably weren't even born in the year 2000. And for those of us, like myself, who were old enough to know what was going on in culture like that in the year 2000, we're having trouble remembering back that far. It's okay, that happens. But for those of you who don't know, here's basically what happened. Every year, the Southern Baptist Convention picks a new place to hold their annual meeting. Well, for the year 2000, for their year 2000 meeting, they were going to meet in Chicago. And so to get ready for that, they sent pamphlets out to each of their members, and these pamphlets explained how to pray for and evangelize people of different religions, including Jewish people. Well, people were furious about this. In fact, the famous American rabbi, Rabbi Botaic, he went on TV, and this is what he had to say to the Southern Baptist Convention. He said, quote, I would advise you to embrace tolerance, because clearly your belief system that you've now adopted is leading you to be intolerant. You want to convert your Jewish brethren to a spiritually totalitarian system. Well, I have one more example for you, and this one is much more recent. How many of you have heard of the Nashville Statement? Nashville Statement, okay, several of you. For those of you who haven't heard, basically there's a coalition of Christian leaders and theologians that published a statement just 2 years ago that they called the Nashville Statement. And in this statement, they explain what they think is God's will for marriage and for gender and for sexuality. Well, when this statement was published, people all across the nation were outraged because it said things like, quote, we deny that God has designed marriage to be a homosexual relationship. And this one, quote, we affirm that it is sinful to approve of homosexual immorality and transgenderism. Well, Alil Cruz responded very swiftly to this statement. He responded just 3 days later. He published an article in the New York Times, and he's a journalist, and he's the executive director of the organization Faith in America. And here's what he had to say. He said, quote, let's see here. This week, an influential group of evangelical Christians publicly doubled down on intolerance in a message about lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people that represents a renewed commitment to open bigotry. Well, I think Alil Cruz speaks for a lot of people who were upset by the Nashville Statement. So there's a lot of intolerance in our society. But who do you think was being the most intolerant here between these different stories? So we won't do a show of hands because these are controversial issues. No one likes to show their hands on that kind of thing. But just in your own mind, vote on your own. Try to decide who here is being the most intolerant. So who thinks it was Dan Cathy, the president of Chick-fil-A, that was being the most intolerant? Who thinks that it was Phil Robertson from Duck Dynasty? Who thinks that it was the Southern Baptist Convention that was being the most intolerant? And who thinks it was the people behind the Nashville statement that were being the most intolerant? Or who thinks instead it was the Philadelphia City Councilman Jim Kenney who was being the most intolerant? Who thinks that it was Wilson Cruz from GLAAD who was actually being the most intolerant? What about Rabbi Botaic? And what about the New York Times journalist Alil Cruz? See, who in these stories is being intolerant? Well, it all depends on how we define this word tolerance. You see, there are two different definitions of the word tolerance. There's the modern definition of tolerance, which just about everyone uses, and then there's the classic definition of tolerance. This is what tolerance used to mean. And so we're going to look at these two definitions of tolerance and compare them. So first, let's look at the modern definition of tolerance. The modern definition of tolerance is accepting all views as equally valid. Accepting all views as equally valid. And that sounds like a very loving, very accepting approach. The only problem with it is that there are two major problems with it. The first problem is that this definition is actually self-contradictory. It contradicts itself. Let me give you an example. Let's say there's a group that published a statement that said, we should love all bald people. Now, needless to say, I would sign that beautiful statement. I mean, that's lovely. It brings a tear to my eye. But now what if instead there was another group that published a counter statement, and their statement is, we should hate all bald people. I know, right? Not cool. This is messed up. Sad. Now, which of these two statements is the intolerant statement? The second statement is the intolerant one, right? I mean, that's pretty obvious under any definition of tolerance. The second statement is intolerant. But remember, under the modern definition of tolerance, we should accept all views as equally valid, including that second view. So in order to be tolerant, we should accept intolerance. So if you try to use the modern definition of tolerance, you end up in a contradiction. So that's why the Philadelphia councilman, Jim Kenney, ended up contradicting himself. Remember, he said, here, I'll just repeat his quote for you. He said, quote, as an American, you are legally entitled to your opinion, regardless of how insensitive and intolerant it may be. But as a fellow American and as an elected member of the Philadelphia City Council, I'm entitled to express my opinion as well. So please, take a hike and take your intolerance with you. So just to recap, Dan Cathy said that homosexuality is immoral. And Councilman Kenney was calling Dan Cathy intolerant because he was making that moral judgment, because Dan Cathy had made a moral judgment about homosexuals. But think about it. Isn't Councilman Kenney also making a moral judgment? He's calling Dan Cathy immoral. He's calling him intolerant and saying that that is immoral. So, Councilman Kenney is not being tolerant of Dan Cathy. Councilman Kenney is not being tolerant of Dan Cathy. So if Dan Cathy is intolerant, Councilman Kenney is also intolerant by the same standard. That's also why Rabbi Botaic actually ended up contradicting himself. Remember, he said, quote, I would advise you to embrace tolerance because clearly your belief system that you've now adopted is leading you to be intolerant. You want to convert your Jewish brother into a spiritually totalitarian system. So, just to recap again, the Southern Baptist Convention is not being accepting of other religious views. They're saying that we need to convert Jewish people and people of other religions. And Rabbi Botaic is calling the Southern Baptists intolerant because they don't accept other religious views. But think about it. Does the rabbi accept the Southern Baptist religious views? No. So Rabbi Botaic is not being tolerant of the Southern Baptist Convention. So if the Southern Baptist Convention is intolerant in the same way, then Rabbi Botaic is also intolerant. Now, that's also why the New York Times journalist Alil Cruz was contradicting himself too. You also see it here. Alil Cruz said, quote, "This week an influential group of evangelical Christians publicly doubled down on intolerance in a message about LGBT people that represents a renewed commitment to open bigotry." So, the people behind the Nashville statement were saying that homosexuality is immoral, right? And Alil Cruz was calling them intolerant because of their moral judgment, because the people behind the Nashville statement made that moral judgment. But again, isn't Alil Cruz making a moral judgment of his own? He's making a moral judgment. He's calling the people behind the Nashville statement immoral. He's calling them intolerant and saying that that is immoral. So Alil Cruz wasn't tolerant of the people behind the Nashville statement. So if the people behind the Nashville statement were intolerant, then in the same way, then Alil Cruz was also intolerant. So my point is that this kind of tolerance actually ends up in a contradiction. It ends up contradicting itself.